Welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling something pretty crucial. Dopamine receptors.
Yeah, they're super important.
They really are.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you're interested in how they work,
For sure.
especially, those D1 and D2 families.
Right.
Their roles in, motor control and reward.
Yeah, and
Even how they're involved.
these tiny things.
Yeah, these tiny things are involved in conditions like Parkinson's
Uh-huh.
and schizophrenia. So that's what we're going to be focusing on.
Yeah, that's a great plan.
And get this, we're going to uncover some pretty surprising details about how they actually function within the cell.
Oh, yeah.
Like these things called microdomains,
Right.
which kind of challenge the traditional view of how cell signaling works.
Absolutely. Before we dive into the specifics of D1 and D2, though,
Okay.
maybe we should take a step back and just quickly recap why dopamine is so important
Yeah, good idea.
in the first place. So think of dopamine as like this messenger molecule, a neurotransmitter, right, that carries signals between brain cells.
Right.
These signals are essential for a whole range of functions.
Yeah, so it's not just about feeling good, right?
Oh, no.
Dopamine is involved in some pretty fundamental brain processes.
Exactly.
I mean, really fundamental stuff.
Yeah, like think about movement, motivation, learning, pleasure.
Yeah.
All these things are influenced by dopamine.
Right.
And those processes,
Like I said, fundamental.
yeah, they really depend on how the dopamine signal is actually received
Right.
and interpreted by the brain. And that's where these dopamine receptors come in.
Okay.
They're like specialized locks on brain cells.
Okay.
And dopamine is the key that fits those locks.
So dopamine is the key. Got it.
Right.
What happens when it unlocks those D1 and D2 receptors?
Well, things get really interesting here.
Okay.
These receptors aren't just passively receiving signals.
Okay.
They actually trigger a whole cascade of events inside the cell,
Mm-hmm.
kind of like a chain reaction. Importantly, the D1 and D2 families,
Okay.
they interact with different players in this cascade, leading to distinct effects.
So it's not just about the dopamine itself, but which receptor it binds to.
Exactly.
It's like different domino effects depending on which domino you tip over first.
That's a great way to put it. So let's take the D1 receptors as an example.
Okay.
When dopamine binds to a D1 receptor, it activates a protein called a G protein,
Okay.
and specifically a type called GS.
GS, yeah. So each receptor.
So each receptor has its preferred G protein.
Yeah, you could think about it that way.
Okay, what happens next?
So this G protein, it then sets off a cascade that ultimately increases
Okay.
the levels of something called cyclic AMP or CAMP inside the cell.
CAMP.
Yeah, so think of CAMP as like a kind of cellular messenger
Okay.
that can turn other processes on or off.
So increased CAMP is like flipping a switch to on.
Yeah, you got it.
Okay.
And this on switch?
Triggered by these D1 receptors is
Right.
often linked to feelings of reward and the initiation of movement.
So D1 is like the gas pedal.
You can think about it that way. Yeah, propelling you forward.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do the D2 receptors fit into all of this? Are they hitting the brakes?
They do play a role in inhibition,
Okay.
but it's more nuanced than just being brakes.
Okay.
D2 receptors also interact with the G protein,
Okay.
but it's a different type. It's called G.
So G, okay. So different partner leads to a different outcome, I'm guessing.
Exactly. So instead of increasing CAMP,
Okay.
activation of G actually decreases CAMP levels inside the cell.
Ah, so it's like flipping that switch to off then,
Yeah, you can think about it that way.
instead of on.
Instead of on, exactly. And while this off switch might sound like it's always opposing D1,
Right.
it's more about fine-tuning the system.
Okay.
D2 receptors, they're involved in motor control, but they also play a role in a lot of complex functions.
Like what?
Like regulating attention and emotions.
It's amazing how these tiny, molecular interactions
Yeah,
can have such a huge impact on our behavior.
absolutely.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But I have to ask about something that really caught my eye in the research you sent me.
Oh, yeah.
This idea of microdomains.
Mm-hmm.
It almost sounds like neighborhoods within the cell.
That's a fantastic analogy. And it's a relatively new concept
Okay.
that's changing how we think about cell signaling.
Really?
Yeah, so the
Huh.
traditional view is that molecules like CAMP just diffused freely
Okay.
throughout the cell, acting globally.
Ah.
But this microdomain theory,
Yeah.
it suggests that these signal events are actually happening in very specific
Wow.
and localized compartments.
So instead of a free-for-all, it's more like a well-organized city
Yeah,
with different districts specializing in different activities.
exactly. And there's growing evidence to support this idea.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so for example, researchers have found that heart muscle cells,
Hmm.
called cardiomyocytes, respond differently to two different signals,
Okay.
adrenaline and prostaglandin E2, even though both of these signals
Nice.
activate the same G's cascade.
So the one we talked about with the D1 receptors.
Exactly.
So if it was just one big pool of CAMP,
Right.
the response should be the same,
Exactly.
but that's not what they found.
Right, and that's where the microdomain theory helps explain things.
Okay.
It suggests that even though the same pathway is activated, the signaling is
Yeah.
happening in different microdomains
Wow.
within the cell, leading to distinct outcomes.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's like having specialized workshops within a factory, each producing a different product.
Okay, so this is blowing my mind.
Yeah.
It's like the cell has its own internal postal service, right?
Yeah,
Directing those signals to very specific addresses.
that's a great way to put it.
But how do these microdomains actually form? Like, what keeps those signals contained?
That's where a group of proteins called akinase anchoring proteins, or ACAPs,
ACAPs. Okay.
come into play.
Right.
Think of ACAPs as like the scaffolding
Okay.
that holds everything together
Within these microdomains.
within these microdomains. Yeah,
Okay, so they're like the architects of these little cellular neighborhoods.
exactly.
How do they work?
Well, AKPs have this remarkable ability to bind to an enzyme called protein kinase A, or PKA,
PKA,
which
dude.
is a key player in the CAMP signaling pathway.
Okay, and just reminding myself and the listener, increased CAMP can flip those cellular switches on, right?
Right.
PKA is one of the main switches
Exactly.
that CAMP acts on.
Yeah,
So AKPs are bringing PKA, the switch, into these microdomains.
you got it.
Keeping everything organized
Yeah, keeping it localized.
and localized.
Yeah, and because different AKPs can bind to different proteins,
Okay.
they can create very specific signaling hubs within the cell.
So it's like having different teams of workers, right?
Right.
Each with their own set of tools.
Yeah.
Gathered in specific locations within the factory.
Yeah.
To perform their tasks.
That's a great way to think about it.
This is incredibly complex,
Yeah.
but it's starting to make sense.
Good. Good.
It's like the cell has its own internal city planning department,
I like it.
right? Making sure everything runs smoothly.
Yeah, and the more we learn about these microdomains, the more we realize how crucial they are for everything from cell growth and development
Wow.
to even learning and memory.
Wow.
It's really quite remarkable.
It's amazing to think that all of this is happening within each of our cells.
I know, it's pretty mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But before we get too lost in the weeds here,
Right.
let's bring it back to dopamine receptors.
Okay.
How do they fit into this microdomain picture?
That's a great question, and it's something that researchers are still actively investigating.
I bet.
But there's growing evidence
Yeah.
that dopamine receptors themselves might actually be localized within specific microdomains.
Wow.
So, meaning that their effects are even more finely tuned than previously thought.
So it's not just about the type of receptor or the
Right.
G protein it activates,
Yeah.
but also its specific address within the cell.
Exactly.
It's like realizing that a street address isn't enough.
Right.
You also need the apartment number
Yeah,
to
exactly.
deliver the message to the right person.
I like that analogy.
Okay.
And this realization is opening up new avenues of research
Yeah.
into how dopamine signals are processed
Right.
and how they contribute to various brain functions, including those
yeah.
involved in diseases like Parkinson's and schizophrenia.
This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit,
Yeah.
my brain is working overtime trying to keep up with all these details.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. Maybe we should take a breather
Okay.
and recap what we've learned so far about dopamine receptors
Sure.
and how they work
Okay.
before we go any further.
Sounds good. Let's break it down step by step.
Okay.
So it's crystal clear for our listener.
Great idea. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
We've got dopamine, our star messenger, right?
Yep.
Looking to bind to its specific receptor,
Right.
either D1 or D2.
Mm-hmm.
What happens next?
Well, once dopamine binds to its receptor, it triggers the activation of that receptor's preferred G protein partner.
Right.
G's for D1, G for D2.
Right. Those G proteins, they're like the receptor's entourage,
Exactly.
ready to carry out its instructions.
Right, and their instructions are pretty clear. Modulate the levels of CAMP inside the cell.
Okay.
G's increases CAMP, flipping those cellular switches on,
Uh-huh.
while G decreases CAMP, flipping them off.
Right.
It's a delicate balance, kind of like a dimmer switch,
Yeah.
controlling the intensity of the signal.
And we know those different signals have very different effects.
Yeah.
D1 with its on switch linked to reward and movement,
Right.
while D2 with its off switch
Yeah.
involved in like more nuanced motor control.
Yeah.
Things like attention and emotion.
Yeah. Precisely. But, remember, it's not as simple as D1 always being good and D2 always being bad.
Right.
Both are crucial for healthy brain function.
Of course.
And their effects really depend on the specific brain region
Right.
and the context of the situation.
That makes sense, yeah. It's like any dynamic system. You need both the gas pedal and the brakes to function properly.
exactly.
But I'm curious, are there any other important differences between these receptor families?
There are.
Okay.
We've talked about their G protein partners
Mhm.
and their effects on CAMP.
Yeah.
But another key difference lies in their distribution within the brain.
Okay.
D1 receptors are highly concentrated in areas like the striatum,
Okay.
which is like a central hub for movement and reward-based learning.
So when you experience that rush of pleasure after like a delicious meal or a job well done,
Yeah.
those D1 receptors in the striatum are like firing away.
Exactly. They play a crucial role in those feelings of reward and reinforcement, helping you learn which behaviors lead to positive outcomes.
Yeah.
D2 receptors, on the other hand,
Okay.
they're more widely distributed
Okay.
throughout the brain.
Okay. So they're covering more ground,
Yeah,
which suggests they're involved in a wider range of functions.
absolutely.
Okay.
And while we often think of D2 receptors in the context of movement inhibition,
Right. Putting on the brakes.
yeah, like putting on the brakes,
Yeah.
their role is much more complex.
Okay.
They're also involved in things like regulating attention,
Uh-huh.
processing emotions, making decisions.
It's amazing to think that these tiny receptors
I know.
are playing such important roles in, like, shaping our thoughts,
Right.
our feelings, and our actions.
Absolutely.
It's like they're the puppet masters of our brain.
Well, I wouldn't say puppet masters exactly,
Okay.
but they are certainly key players in the orchestra of brain activity.
Right.
And, we've only just begun to explore the complexity of this system.
Right there.
There's a whole world of subtypes.
Oh, subtypes.
Within those D1 and D2 families.
Okay, so it's even more intricate than we thought.
Oh, yeah.
Like, instead of just two main players, we've got a whole cast of characters
Right.
on each side.
Exactly. It's like realizing that your favorite movie has a whole extended universe of characters
Okay, yeah.
with their own backstories and motivations.
Right.
And these subtypes add another layer of specificity to dopamine signaling.
Got it.
For example, within the D1-like family, you have D1 and D5 receptors.
Okay, so what's the difference between those two?
Well, they both activate that G pathway
Yeah.
and increase CAMP,
Uh-huh.
but they have different affinities for dopamine,
Okay.
meaning some are more easily activated than others.
Right.
They're also expressed in different regions of the brain,
Okay.
suggesting they play distinct roles.
So it's like they're speaking the same language,
Right.
but with different accents and dialects.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Where are these D1 and D5 subtypes found in the brain?
So D1 receptors are the most abundant subtype,
Okay.
and they're highly concentrated in the striatum,
Uh-huh.
particularly in a region called the dorsal striatum,
Okay.
which is heavily involved in motor control and habit formation.
Ah, so those are the receptors that are really driving those learned behaviors.
Yeah.
Like brushing your teeth or driving a car.
Exactly. Those repeated actions become almost automatic,
Yeah.
thanks to the D1 receptors in the dorsal striatum.
Okay.
D5 receptors, though less abundant,
Okay.
are also found in the striatum,
Wow.
but they're more concentrated in an area called the ventral striatum,
Got it.
which is closely tied to reward and motivation.
Interesting. So D5 might be more involved in like those pleasurable feelings associated with rewards.
That's one theory.
Uh,
D5 receptors are also found in other areas like the hippocampus,
Right.
which plays a crucial role in memory formation.
Right.
So their exact functions are still being explored.
Yeah. It sounds like there's a lot more to learn
Yeah, there is.
about D5.
But it's clear that they're involved in a range of cognitive processes.
Okay, so we've got D1 driving habits
Uh-huh.
and D5 possibly involved in reward and memory.
Right.
What about team D2? What kind of subtypes are we dealing with there?
So the D2-like family includes D2, D3, and D4 receptors.
Okay.
And just like with the D1 family,
Yeah.
each subtype has its own unique distribution and function.
Got it. Let's break those down. What about the D2 receptor itself? Where does it hang out?
So D2 receptors, like I mentioned earlier,
Right.
are more widely distributed than D1.
Okay.
They're found in the striatum, of course,
Right.
but also in the substantia nigra,
Right.
a region that plays a critical role in movement,
Yeah.
and the frontal cortex,
Right.
which is involved in higher-level cognitive functions.
So D2 is playing a role in both movement and thinking. That's a pretty wide range.
It is.
Ah.
And its diverse distribution reflects its involvement in a range of processes, including motor control, attention, decision-making, and even emotional regulation.
It's remarkable how a single receptor type can be involved in so many different things.
I know, it's pretty amazing.
What about those other subtypes, D3 and D4? What are their specialties?
D3 receptors are primarily found in areas associated with emotion and reward, like the limbic system.
Okay.
They're thought to be involved in motivation, reinforcement, and even addiction.
So those cravings you get for your favorite foods or activities, maybe those D3 receptors are playing a role.
It's certainly possible.
Yep.
They seem to be particularly sensitive to those rewarding experiences.
Fascinating. So what about D4? What's its story?
D4 receptors are a bit of a mystery.
Okay.
They're less abundant than the other subtypes
Okay.
and are found in areas like the frontal cortex and hippocampus.
Right.
Research suggests they might be involved in higher cognitive functions like working memory and decision-making.
Okay. So we've got a whole team of dopamine receptor subtypes,
We do.
each with its own, unique set of skills. But with all this complexity, how do scientists even begin to study these receptors? How do they figure out what they're doing?
It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
But researchers are developing increasingly sophisticated tools
Okay.
to explore these intricate systems.
Like what?
One powerful technique is fluorescent microscopy,
Okay.
which allows us to actually visualize the location and movement of these receptors.
Wait, we can actually see these tiny receptors?
We can. That's incredible.
It is. By attaching fluorescent tags to these receptors,
Okay.
we can track their movements within the cell and see how they interact with other proteins.
Wow. So we can actually observe those D1 and D2 receptors
Yeah.
clustering together
Yes.
in those microdomains we talked about earlier.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
And with optogenetics,
Okay.
another groundbreaking technique,
Okay.
we can actually use light to activate or inhibit specific neurons
Wow.
that express certain dopamine receptor subtypes.
That's why. This allows us to study their roles in real time in living animals
Wow.
and see how they contribute to behavior.
It's amazing how far we've come in our ability to study the brain
I know, it's amazing.
at such a fine level of detail.
Right.
But I have to admit, even with these incredible tools,
Yeah.
understanding the intricacies of dopamine signaling feels like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle
It is a complex puzzle for sure.
with thousands of pieces.
Yeah. But every piece we fit together brings us closer to understanding
Yeah.
how this remarkable system shapes who we are.
And with all this talk about receptors and subtypes,
Yeah.
I almost forgot about our initial question about their roles in conditions like Parkinson's and schizophrenia.
Oh, right.
Can we connect those dots?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Understanding how dopamine receptors work and especially how those subtypes differ
Right.
is crucial for understanding these complex diseases and developing effective treatments.
So let's start with Parkinson's.
Okay.
How are dopamine receptors involved in that condition?
In Parkinson's disease, there's a significant loss of dopamine-producing cells
Okay.
in a brain region called the substantia nigra,
Right.
which, as we mentioned earlier, is heavily populated by D2 receptors.
Right. And that area is involved in movement.
Exactly.
So this loss of dopamine must really disrupt the delicate balance of signaling
It does.
in those motor pathways.
Yeah, and this disruption leads to the classic symptoms of Parkinson's: tremors, rigidity, slow movements, and difficulty with balance.
So treatments for Parkinson's often aim to boost dopamine levels in the brain.
They do.
Right.
Medications like levodopa,
Right.
a precursor to dopamine,
Uh-huh.
can help replenish those depleted dopamine stores
Okay.
and alleviate those motor symptoms.
So it's not just about the amount of dopamine,
Right.
but also about getting it to the right place in the brain
Exactly.
where those D2 receptors are waiting.
That's one of the challenges in treating Parkinson's.
Yeah.
Ensuring that dopamine replacement therapies reach the intended targets and restore that delicate balance of signaling.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about schizophrenia? How does dopamine fit into that picture?
Schizophrenia is a much more complex disorder,
Okay.
and the role of dopamine is still being actively investigated.
Yeah.
But one prevailing theory
Okay.
is that there's an overactivity of certain dopamine pathways,
Okay.
particularly those involving D2 receptors
Okay.
in specific brain regions.
So instead of too little dopamine, like in Parkinson's,
Yeah,
it's a case of too much
right.
in the wrong places.
Right, that's one way to think about it.
Okay.
And this overactivity is thought to contribute to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like hallucinations and delusions.
Wow. So the same neurotransmitter
I know, it's pretty amazing.
acting on the same type of receptor
Right.
can lead to very different outcomes,
Yes,
depending on the location and the level of activity.
absolutely.
It's like a delicate dance, and even a small misstep
Right.
can throw everything off balance.
It is a delicate dance. And that's why understanding the nuances of dopamine signaling, from those different receptor subtypes to the intricate organization within those microdomains, is so crucial for developing more targeted and effective treatments for these complex diseases.
This is all incredibly fascinating,
Yeah,
but I can already sense that our listeners' head might be spinning with all this information.
I can imagine.
Maybe we should take a moment to recap what we've learned about the different dopamine receptor subtypes and their roles.
That's a great idea. Let's consolidate what we've covered so far.
Okay, so on Team D1, we have D1 itself, which is all about habit formation and is mostly found in the dorsal striatum.
All right.
And then we have D5, which seems to be linked to reward and memory,
Yeah.
and it's found in places like the ventral striatum and the hippocampus.
Yeah.
What about Team D2?
Good recap. So on Team D2, we have the D2 receptor, which is kind of the all-rounder,
All right.
involved in motor control, attention, decision-making, and even emotion.
Right.
It's found in a variety of areas, including the striatum substantia nigra and frontal cortex.
Right, we covered all that.
Then you've got D3, which is hanging out in the limbic system
Uh-huh.
and is thought to play a big role in motivation reinforcement and possibly even addiction.
Right.
And lastly, there's the mysterious D4 receptor,
Yeah,
found in the frontal cortex and hippocampus,
okay.
potentially involved in working memory and decision-making.
Wow. It's amazing how each subtype has its own unique role to play.
Yeah, it is.
It's like a complex symphony
Mhm.
with each instrument contributing to the overall harmony of the brain.
I like that analogy.
And, we've talked a lot about how these receptors work by activating G proteins,
Right.
influencing KMP levels,
Uh-huh.
but their influence goes even deeper, right?
It does.
Did you know that dopamine receptors can directly modify other proteins within the cell?
That's right.
Really? So it's like they have a whole other level of control
Yeah.
beyond those signaling cascades we've been discussing.
Exactly. And one of the key ways they do this is through a process called phosphorylation.
Phosphorylation.
Yeah, it's like attaching a little Post-it note to a protein,
Okay.
changing its shape and therefore its function.
So it's not just about turning a switch on or off,
Right.
but about fine-tuning the activity of those proteins.
Precisely. And the key player in this process
Yeah.
is an enzyme we've encountered before, protein kinase A, or PKA.
Right, okay.
Remember, this is the enzyme that's often anchored in those microdomains by AKPs.
Right, those scaffolding proteins create those specialized signaling hubs within the cell.
Exactly. So when dopamine activates its receptor,
Uh,
it can trigger a cascade that leads to the activation of PKA,
okay.
which can then phosphorylate a whole variety of other proteins within the cell.
It's like a chain of command with dopamine giving the orders and PKA carrying them out.
That's a great way to think about it. And these phosphorylation events can have a wide range of effects,
Like what?
depending on the target protein. They can influence everything from ion channel activity, those gateways that control the flow of ions in and out of cells, to gene expression,
Wow.
the process that determines which proteins are made by the cell.
So it's not just about those immediate signaling effects,
Right.
but about shaping the long-term behavior of the cell as well.
Exactly.
It's like dopamine is playing a role in both the short-term and the long-term strategy of the brain.
You got it. And this multi-layered control is what makes dopamine such a powerful and versatile neurotransmitter.
It really is. It's involved in everything from our most basic movements
Right.
to our most complex thoughts and emotions.
It is truly remarkable.
It is. It is. And I have to say, learning about all of this has given me a whole new appreciation for the complexity and the elegance of the brain.
I agree. It's humbling to realize how much is happening at the molecular level, orchestrating everything we do, think, and feel.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of dopamine receptors, what's the key takeaway for our listener? What do we really want them to remember?
I think the most important message is that dopamine receptors are far more than simple on-off switches.
Right.
They're dynamic, complex, and incredibly influential players in a wide range of brain functions.
For sure.
Understanding them is crucial not only for treating diseases like Parkinson's and schizophrenia,
Yep.
but also for understanding the very essence of what makes us human.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like we've been given a glimpse behind the curtain of the brain,
Yeah.
revealing the intricate machinery that makes us tick.
And the most exciting part is that there's still so much more to discover.
Right.
The research continues to evolve, so who knows what incredible insights we'll uncover in the years to come.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of dopamine receptors.
It was my pleasure.
Until next time, keep those synapses firing
Yeah, keep them firing.
and never stop exploring the wonders of your own brain.